everyone, and welcome to Follow the White Rabbit, where we go down the rabbit hole to explore the intersection of privacy, human rights, technology, and democracy. I'm your host, Alex Kahaya. I'm super excited to have Gregory on the show today. He's a personal friend of mine, and thanks for being here today.
Yeah, I'm super grateful to be here, Alex. I'm excited to jam.
So I've known Gregory for I think 3 years now, really since I got into the cryptocurrency space, and um, they're solving a really important problem that I care a lot about personally, and it has to do with climate change. And I just want to start off with a question for you, Gregory. That's I think you have a simple answer to, but it's the thing that kind of hooked me into the mission that you guys are trying to accomplish. And it's how many years of good soil do we have left on the planet?
Yeah. Well, according to a UN study that was released like 5 years ago, we had at that point 50 harvests left at the current rate of topsoil erosion, which hasn't improved. So, yeah, not so many, right? We definitely have to radically transform the way that we're doing agriculture so that we don't. I mean, climate change is one element of this, right? But as you're pointing out, topsoil loss has destroyed several civilizations that we know about. I mean, this is not something that's sort of, a fringe apocalyptic, you know, uh, magical thinking. This is something that there's well documented evidence of topsoil loss leading to civilizational collapse a few times over. So it's definitely something to pay attention to.
Yeah, I mean, when the first time I saw you guys pitch, it was at a small, intimate event up in San Francisco. That was when we first met, and we all knew mutual friends, right? That's how I heard about you because we had mutual friends here in Santa Barbara. And Brian and I, Brian Fox, who's a co-founder at Orchid, uh, were happened to be up there for work, so we went to dinner and met up with you guys. And I had no idea what regenerative agriculture was. I had never been exposed to that. I knew what climate change was, and I was trying to understand what you guys were building because it was this blockchain thing, and this way to incentivize people to practice regenerative agriculture and save the planet. And the thing that really solidified it for me and that made it stick was that comment and that data point of 50, 50 harvests left.
Well,
Um,
it's like it hits home, right? Because you have kids, I have kids, even within our lifetime, but definitely in the lifetime of our children, just the way we're doing business is just going to make it impossible to keep doing business.
mhm.
So something's got to give.
So I want to get into like your background and how you got to where you are today. But before we do that, I want to touch on the thing that you were talking about, like the civilizations that have been wiped out by, topsoil erosion. We haven't actually had a conversation about that. Give me a history lesson here. What civilizations? How did it happen? What did it look like?
Yeah, well, I mean, I just have to lean on or stand on the shoulder of giants for this one. Jared Diamond wrote a really excellent book called Collapse, which is kind of a compilation of the historical and anthropological sort of facts of different civilizations dealing with environmental degradation and either surviving or collapsing. So there's been a number of different iterations of this. There's a pretty strong case to be made that a lot of the in the Bronze Age there was like a giant civilization collapse, like Egypt and Sumer and Babylonia and Assyria. There was a moment, and I'm a little, this isn't necessarily my everyday domain, so I'm a little fuzzy on the dates, but there was a moment, I don't know, I think it was like 3000 BC or something, in which there was sort of a pan sort of Eastern Mediterranean where all of the civilizations were collapse. Like all these big city states, and it was just like boom, it was just gone. And it turns out if you look at the pollen records and you look at sort of the archaeological data associated with environmental conditions, it looks as though that was precipitated by crop failures and drought, and essentially all of that was exacerbated by massive deforestation and soil loss due to the humans changing the environment from, you know, mosaics of savanna and forests and intact wetlands and all of this sort of healthier ecology, and just sort of like whacking all that, cutting down the trees, overgrazing it, and planting a lot of wheat over and over again for, you know, enough generations that all of a sudden the environment just was not capable of supporting those civilizations anymore. And so that's one that's you know, probably pretty deeply ingrained into our cultural reality, because we all have, you know, ancestors in some way from these areas that have gone through these collapses. So, you know, there's also the Mayan collapse, is similar. You know, everybody knows about Easter Island, right? Where there's this mysterious place in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, which has these giant, you know, heads that have been carved out of stone that are sort of mysteriously standing there. And in order to construct those heads, they basically chopped down the whole forest on the island in order to have an economy to prop up these heads, which represented status. And then after they put the last head up, they had no more, you know, they had no forest, they had no animals, they had no food, and the entire civilization collapsed. Everyone starved to death, and there's, you know, and then it was repopulated a little bit later, but in a much more degraded, you know, ecological state. And that, to me, that is a cautionary tale, because there's this society dedicated to putting up these status symbols. And if that doesn't ring a bell for people who are out competing in the rat race right now for your status symbols, whatever that might be, you know, I mean, it could come at a cost, and that cost could be, you know, like our civilization's ability to exist on the planet.
Yeah, so the book was called Collapse. Richard Diamond, you said?
Jared Diamond.
Jared Diamond. Okay, all right, I'll have to check that one out. And if you're listening, you know, definitely check it out to get more of the history and the background on that. So why don't you walk me through your background? You know, what led you to working in this field? Maybe a little bit about TGI and how you ended up conceiving of Regen Network.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So, well, so I grew up in a sort of a small town in Alaska, mostly, and my dad was like working on the oil slope, essentially, like working in the oil gas industry, and my mom was a wildlife biologist. So I kind of had these like two different, um, like worldviews, or just, you know, just two very different livelihoods. I mean, they're both awesome people, and um, so I think that's just like, it's an interesting foundation to be coming from in some way, and I think it influenced the way that I thought about things. You know, it was this fishing town, so I fished growing up. You know, I commercial fished. I also worked for the Fish and Wildlife, or Fish and Game Service. I worked for the Watershed Forum. I sort of like got to participate in this natural resource, this fishery, from every different angle. You know, I was a fisherman, everything. I got to see all the different parts of this economy, and all that entire economy was based on the health of the salmon, right? Which is this, and the health of the salmon is based on the health of the ocean, and how people get together and organize themselves so as to not over extract those salmon is a very complex issue. So somehow I think that all just sort of played into my life, really. I don't know. I was really driven to find solutions. When I was in college, I studied environmental science, which is kind of like, I jokingly call it the science of doom. Because the whole science is just, you know, it's like, wow, we're taking an eyes wide open look at the state of climate and the state of our soils and all of these things, and it's pretty shocking when you really walk into it. It's pretty shocking, right? If you really understand and
the
are
50
willing.
harvest left thing is a good.
some people may sort of have some weird accelerationist Mad Max post-apocalyptic fantasy fetish thing going on,
Not
but
me. No
no
thanks.
way. Like it's
I
just
mean, I would
not.
survive. I would totally survive, but I'd rather keep that in my imagination. So,
Yeah, I mean, you can play a computer game if you want that. We don't need to
yeah.
be, making that the world that we live in. There's no need. There's just no need to do that. So anyway, I was really attracted to solutions. Like, where are there people who are, creating dynamic ways for humans to live, not just sustainably with ecosystems, but in a way in which their human presence is making that ecosystem healthier. Because I just firmly believe that is totally possible, and it's not only possible; it should sort of be like the prime directive. It's like it's the moral imperative. How do we figure out how our presence on Earth makes Earth healthier, right? As a species, it just seems like a clear ethical sort of line to me. And that's my guiding star. That's my North Star right there. And yeah, Terragenesis was one of my first businesses. There were a couple there in parallel. And we focused on first doing sort of design and business support for farms around the world who were trying to like have farm operations, agriculture operations in a way that actually increased soil health and increased biodiversity and increased water quality and really like makes the ecosystem more healthy and more thriving. And when you visit a farm that has that as its goal and they're really working hard at it, you can tell. I mean, they're beautiful places to spend time. So it's very, meaningful. But
Let's talk about that for a second because there's a good movie on Netflix about this. I think it's The Biggest Little Farm or something. What is that?
yeah, 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 The Biggest Little Farm. Something. I think that's right.
Right?
Yeah, it's a great,
I'll have to look
movie.
that up.
And recently,
Awesome
Kiss the
movie.
Ground on Netflix as well. Recent documentary that's out. Some friends of ours produced it. It's fantastic. It just tells the story of the shift from a little bit about how we got here in terms of industrial ag and all these things. But yeah, what does it feel like and look like to be in an agro ecosystem
Yeah,
that's
so the
thriving?
reason I brought it up is because it's a good example, and I think if you could just succinctly do a side by side comparison of farm A that's like an industrial ag farm. I don't know what you would choose that they would be doing on that farm, but then like farm
Corn.
B that's a regenerative, farm. What do they
Yeah.
look? What's the big difference? How does that operate? What are the consequences of the way they operate?
Well, I mean, yeah, I'll do that with some disclaimers about, every place is different. And I think this shows up in a lot of different ways. But, just take, let's just take like a industrial corn production that is probably being used to feed cows or make ethanol. It's not even probably used for human feed. So you're in Iowa and people may have, may live there. People may have seen it from above. People may have driven by. You stand there, and as far as the eye can see, there's a single crop, and it's corn, and it's corn for miles. And in order to sustain that corn for miles, because nature doesn't want to grow corn for miles, that's not what nature wants. In order to sustain that, we literally have to invest huge amounts of fossil fuel fertilizers and chemicals and machinery. The caloric imbalance, it just takes so many calories to maintain this like structure that nature doesn't want. That nature doesn't want just a bunch of corn. What nature wants is what was there before was a tall grass perennial prairie with grass that's like 10 feet tall and you know the biggest herds of bison that you've ever seen, massive amounts of biomass, perennial grain systems, and the occasion like savanna systems, trees. It's diverse. There's hundreds or thousands of species of grasses and forbs, and there's dandelions and all sorts of things. So what's the difference when you start to think about what it looks like to have an agro ecosystem that is built on those regenerative principles? I mean, diversity. You can still have corn. Corn is beautiful. I love corn, but you might also grow some other stuff. You might also reintegrate animals. Right now we grow a bunch of corn over here, and then we have a intensive feedlot over there, and we grow the corn and we bring the corn to the cows, and then we bring the cows to slaughter, and everything's disintegrated, which disintegrated, it's also disintegrating our ecosphere. We have to reintegrate things. We have to bring the cattle so that in a seasonal way they come across and they forage on where the corn was. And we need to have trees and other crops interspersed, and we need to leave some space for wildlife because that's part of the regenerative potential. That's part of what keeps everything healthy. That's how you keep a balance in an ecosystem. There needs to be a place for the healthy critters to live. So
Yeah.
it looks very different. You stand there and you see, instead of a desert with a single crop, which is corn, you see 20 different species. You know, you hear birds, it's a qualitatively very different experience.
Anyway, the thing about the biggest little farm or whatever that one was called that caught my eye about the example they gave was the topsoil, and also like the integrated system that you're talking about, right? Like they had this problem on the farm that like this slug was eating a bunch of things on the farm, and then so instead of like using pesticides to get rid of the slug, they decided to buy a bunch of ducks, and the
Yeah.
ducks ate the slug, and then they were
Yeah.
able to sell. Sometimes they made money on the ducks, or the
You
chickens or
sell some
whatever,
duck eggs, you sell some
Right.
ducks. Yeah.
And then the biggest example, because it was based down in San Diego, was part of the reason why they got slugs is because they used is it called crop cover, or like they underneath they had an orchard, and instead of leaving the uh, floor of the orchard bare, they put down this kind of grass.
Yeah.
And the farms that didn't have that grass down, didn't have that crop cover down, when it rained and they had a big flash flood, it literally washed all the soil, all this healthy soil, off the farms.
Yeah. You
And
just
so
lose
it causes it's just gone, and so it causes desertification, and then you can't grow anything there.
Which that quote from the UN about how many harvests we have left, getting under 50 now, that it's because of that. It's because of soil erosion, because of stripping the ground bare, tillage, just planting that single crop, orienting everything around efficiency of a single outcome.
Yeah, yeah, and a lot of the reason why that's happening in industrial agriculture is to prevent things like the slugs from invading and eating your crops, instead of creating like a holistic system where there's balance, right, and that it self equalizes and causes things to work. And it's kind of like a forgotten art in many ways, and I think that transitioned nicely into I think a way for you to explain what Regen Network actually is. And I just want to read off the landing page because I really like how you guys describe it. But Regen Network, platform for a thriving planet. Regen Network aligns economics with ecology to drive regenerative land management. So unpack that for me. What is regen? Because we've articulated the problem, and this is one of the solutions. What is it, and how does it solve this problem?
Yeah, well, I mean, we're really trying to use market mechanisms to realign incentives. So we believe that it should be crystal clear in a market sense why a farmer should be stewarding their landscape in a way that preserves and regenerates that landscape for future generations. So, we have this problem. People talk about the tragedy of the commons, where there's, if you have uh, I don't need to probably explain tragedy of the commons for most of your listeners. It's a common trope. I also think we should probably talk about sometimes tragedy of the market, because there's also a tragedy of the market, which is, this sort of race to the bottom, the desire to be as efficient as possible at extracting the maximum value for short-term gain at the expense of the long-term health. And you can think it's equally applicable outside of ecosystems and agriculture, but ecosystems and agriculture, it's very stark. So what does it look like to appropriately value the health of a farm instead of just your effectiveness at mining that land as quickly as you can? What does it look like to have the right sort of financial instrumentation so that the what is being speculated on in the market is the ability of land stewards to ever increase the health of their soil. What does that look like? That's our founding question. What would it look like? And I think we found a lot of really good answers. These are things like carbon credits. These are things like ecosystem service payments for reducing risk. Because you know what happens when a farmer upstream has a flood and all their topsoil disappears? Well, it all floods downstream and lands in somebody's town, and it costs somebody a bunch of money. So this degenerative spiral of land use has real economic downside, and ecological regeneration has real economic upside. And so what Regen Network is building an ecological ledger system which allows us to track and incorporate that health into our markets so that our markets are no longer just a force for degeneration. In fact, the market can be a force for regeneration. So in a nutshell, that's sort of what we're up to. I'll hand it back over to you because I'm sure you have a lot of questions.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think you pointed out something that I think is really important, which is that the market, companies and governments are starting to recognize and acknowledge that this is a real problem, right? That their bottom line is actually impacted, and that in the next 50 years, it certainly will be impacted. Like they might go out of business, or their customers might not exist anymore
100%.
if they don't start making a change and incentivizing that change and changing
It
their
may
own
be too
behavior.
little too late, but I don't think so. But it's possible if people keep being blind. But I think you're right. So look, some really big news. We've had big news recently, but also there's been huge news in the space. So the Bank of England came out, I think like 10 days or 2 weeks ago, and basically said they're considering carbon emissions risk at $100 a ton. So that's
Wow.
basically they're saying that this is a liability, and they're considering it a liability on all of the businesses that they invest in, they back all their loans. Swiss Re, the giant Swiss reinsurance company, prices carbon risk at $100 a ton. Okay. The current average, like avoided deforestation carbon credit is currently selling at like $4 or $5 a ton. There are not enough, but that's rapidly changing because companies like Microsoft, who we just sold a big bundle of carbon credits to, have made ambitious climate pledges. Like Microsoft pledged to be carbon neutral by 2030, and that includes all their historic emissions. That means from the day that Bill Gates started
Wow.
tinkering in his garage until now, they're going to offset 100% of their carbon emissions, all the way to how much energy you're using running Windows,
Wow. Awesome.
which is
Yeah.
which
So
is
let's talk about that deal.
awesome.
I mean, that's a huge deal. That's obviously one of the biggest, one of the biggest names in technology is using Regen Network to power the
To,
credits that they're purchasing,
to offset their
right?
carbon, and part of what's driving this is where I was going to get to is there's enough companies like Microsoft who's made these pledges, and there's enough sort of like movement right now. There are no longer enough carbon credits to serve the market.
Mm-hmm.
There aren't
Yep.
enough. It's over. It's we have to. So now we have to build an economy that's based on drawing carbon down, and it turns out that agricultural ecosystems and forests are really one of the most cost effective and have the most co-benefits of any way you could do that. There's just so
Yep.
many, it's so efficient essentially to do. So our platform is a way to verify, because this is, it's a public good, it's non rivalrous. If you sequester that carbon into your soil, you're benefiting everybody. How do you prove that that happened? In order to create a market instrument that could be traded. That's the problem we solve. So we make it possible to verify ecological state and then quantify that so that you know how much carbon is where, so that it can be traded or other types of agreements could be made about that as sort of an asset.
Yep. And so everything's open source,
Yep.
uh,
100%
and
open source.
anybody
Yeah.
can use it to spin up these markets and design new protocols for it for verifying different kinds of services that you might provide that would impact, like draw down that carbon. And then so okay. So talk to me more about how that works. Like, how are credits issued on the network, and how does the network actually work? Like, I know that you guys have a token, and it's used for something, and then you have these credits that get issued for specific projects. Like, I mean, you could
Hmm.
use Microsoft as an example. Like, what did they buy, and how did that function?
Yeah, so they bought they bought units of carbon, which on our ledgering system are uh, essentially it's like an NFT that has all of the metadata associated with the claim, so that you can sort of audit who said what about where, when, um, using what data. Is all sort of like every carbon unit has all of that information in it, so that they basically they buy that and they retire it. So there's a public ledger that says they purchased this carbon that was verified and it has now been retired, so they can count it off of their carbon balance basically.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So our system architecture, we have a public proof of stake blockchain that sort of secures this distributed ecological ledger, right? And so we have different custom modules running on that proof of stake backbone. We have a data module that allows us to have sort of a rich data schema and sort of like data graph to structure claims. And then we have a credit module that allows people to mint, uh, trade, and retire credits. Um, and we also have a smart contracting framework, which allows people to play around with a little bit more complex financial instruments and forward or future contracts and other sorts of things like that. Um, and essentially, you could think of it as two layers. There's the first layer, which is the proof of stake blockchain, and the Regen staking token governs and secures that public ledger.
Gotcha.
And then the next layer up is where credits take place and where people can essentially, yeah, assemble and issue what we would call eco tokens or eco credits. Um, we have a sort of like something sort of like a curation registry system, so that there's a set of approved methodologies, and there's also sort of an identity, um, decentralized identity solution, because a lot of this ends up coming back to, you know, um, in some way still, like, we're not creating, at least not at the beginning, there's no pretension that we're sort of creating a giant, omniscient, deterministic state machine that knows everything that's happening everywhere in the world. That's not how it works. This is more about creating more market efficiency to lower the price of auditing something. So our hypothesis is, if the price to audit a claim is as close to zero as it can be, there basically all the incentives are aligned for people to not cheat, because the price of cheating is quite high, right? People will
Yep.
no longer buy the credit from you. People will no longer look to your farm or your organization. If Microsoft cheats and everybody finds out, it costs them a lot. But currently, carbon markets, it also costs a lot to find out if somebody's cheating. It's cost prohibitive. Like, you can't audit
Right.
anything. So we're basically trying to just bring that all down and make it auditable, so that it's really cheap to check and see if something is true that somebody's claiming.
And so these were these Carbon Plus credits, which were the ones that you issued in Australia that Microsoft recently purchased, right?
Yeah.
And what this is one of the largest issuances of that kind of credit in Australia ever. What was the specific way that the carbon was being stored for this? In this case, just as an
Yeah, so
example.
this is representative of a carbon, of a gradual increase in soil organic carbon due to changes in land management specifically uh, what they're calling in that project management intensive rotational grazing. So that is, if we zoom out for a moment and we imagine like the archetype of herd animals out on the African savanna, you see this like giant herd of, water buffalo or a wildebeest, or, these giant herds. They're moving across a landscape pretty quickly. They're not staying in one place for very long, and then they keep moving. But you know, modern approaches to pastoralism or grazing are just like fence an area off and throw some cows out there and let them do their thing. Well, it turns out that cows are kind of like people. Like if the only thing, people will just be like, I'm just going to eat ice cream and French fries all day, even if it kills me. Well, cows are very similar. They'll just eat the same things over and over again, and they'll gradually degrade the health of the ecosystem unless they're managed in such a way that mimics herd movements like forced by predators. So you got to kind of like move them around the landscape. So this management intensive rotational grazing, very similar to holistic management. You're basically compressing the cattle and you're moving them more rapidly across the landscape. And the result of that is, you know, the dynamic between disturbance and photosynthesis and regeneration is that the soil year after year gets deeper and deeper and deeper. And you can monitor that and you can quantify that and you can compare it to other pieces of property nearby. And you can say, wow, because of this action, this farmer, basically has benefited not only their soil, but the whole planet by sequestering carbon down. And so we're going to value that in a carbon credit and use it for the carbon offsetting.
Awesome. I love that example. So you mentioned zoom back out. I kind of want to zoom back out and just because this show is about the intersection of human rights, technology, privacy, and democracy, and I think there is a very real human rights issue here when it comes to how much time we have left on the planet for good soil. Can you just
Future
talk
care.
about
Yeah.
what the scenario? I mean, I know this is the kind of doom and gloom, like we're all environmental science students again, but like what's going to happen? To uh, globally, especially in emerging markets. What's if we fail here? What does the world look like?
Well, it just gets shittier and shittier.
Right.
I mean, so if we continue to pump greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, um, we continue to get greenhouse gas warming. Um, we may already be at some tipping points, but if we go over some tipping points, we get methane releases from because the permafrost stops freezing up in Siberia, and all of a sudden the peat starts sort of essentially like combusting, and there's big methane releases and stuff. So it just creates this sort of vicious cycle. And in some scenarios, that results in things like sea level rising 10 meters, 5 meters. How many people live right on the coast? How many of those people are poor? How many of those people, like I heard somebody say, some conservative pundit be like, well, we'll just, the market will deal with this. Like real estate people will just sell their house, sell and move. It's like, who's going to buy your shack that just got flooded in Bangladesh? Like
Yeah.
that's sorry folks, but that's not actually a good intervention point for a market. That's not
Yeah.
how it works,
Well, then I think
and that's a
also it's
basic
more.
human right. People have the right to the planet being intact. People have the right to not, you know, just the environmental justice is a real thing. And I also really believe in the rights of future generations. So what about the right of our great grandchildren to inherit a planet that's livable? What about, these I believe these are fundamental human rights. And, in order to meet them, we have to meet the complexity of sort of the game theoretic complexity of choices in aggregate to make money in the short term versus to take actions that preserve sort of the principle, or that they preserve the commonwealth in a way that allows for us to do business into the future. And that's, that's, to me, solving that problem, it does boil down to a human rights issue, really fundamentally.
Yeah, and I think also that you talked about the sea level rise, but on the opposite end of the spectrum, this desertification that's
Yeah.
happening all over the planet is causing crisis in food insecurity and also in water, access to water.
Access to water,
And
food insecurity. And also, if we think about, like, another thing people don't oftentimes think about is there's a strong case to be made that the instability in the Middle East is at least partially driven by climate change on a local scale, desertification on a local scale. Syria has been in a 10-year drought. If we don't think that that's part of what's playing into the instability, sure, there's all of this. I don't know how explicit I can get on the show, but
well, I think there are some even more like concrete, direct examples of that. I mean, we've seen this. I think between China and India, these water feuds,
yeah,
or even just you know various states. I mean, here in California, we've had tons of droughts. I live in Santa Barbara, and there were lots of disputes around the last couple of years around access to water between agriculture and between the rest of the community, and who's closer to the source too. Like people closer to the source, kind of saying, "Hey, this is our water, and we need it for our farms, but not your farms down the road."
mm-hmm.
Um, it's already happening, right? It's not like this is a conjecture or a maybe. It's like already happening. All like very concrete examples. I feel like I see them all the time.
Yeah, and look, I mean, I know that your community is really focused on privacy and really focused on sort of you know um, avoiding kind of totalitarian overreach, in a way. And to me, if we can't solve some of these social coordination issues, at, as a community at a grassroots scale, using market mechanisms, using commons, using common sense, then the result of that is invariably, sort of at the nexus of uh, instability and cycles of instability, and then sort of fascist and totalitarian takeovers, because those are the conditions where sort of like command and control thrives, and it seems like it's the only option that people have available. And
Mm-hmm.
I really think there's a strong alignment between sort of how we uplift human agency and human rights and privacy, and sort of venerate our um, just what it means to be alive and be sort of self-determining, and with that comes the responsibility to coordinate on these wicked problems like environmental degradation. And the nice thing is I mean, wow, we live in an era right now where we have the tools to build, for a private company to build a public network.
Yeah,
That is so cool, to be able to
yeah, it is really
involve
cool.
stakeholders, to be able to bring together potentially adversarial groups to generate public goods together through a process based on public infrastructure that was created without the government, that the government can participate in. They're welcome to participate in as a peer. Awesome, right? So anyway, there's something very exciting about all of that I don't think, I don't think this was really possible even 5 years ago. So
Yeah, this is one of the things that excites me the most about being in the blockchain and cryptocurrency space is the ability of these technologies and platforms to align incentives, and that's what you guys are doing. That you brought up a really good term, social coordination, which is actually something that Andreas Antonopoulos talked about a lot on my show a few weeks back, and how that's one of the main things he's excited about. So let's briefly, because we only have a little bit of time left, but briefly, what can people do to get involved with Regen Network, and where are you guys going next? Like, what's coming up soon? Like, do you have anything that you can share with us about what's happening with the company, mainnet launch, all that stuff, so that people can figure out how to prep and jump in and get involved and try to help you guys succeed?
Yeah, well, we're just marching towards mainnet right now. We're wrapping up the final leg of a private sale. We're launching our final incentivized testnet with a over enrolled. We have like more than 400 validators competing to get into the testnet to start, and then from the testnet competing to be anchoring mainnet. It's very exciting. Just sort of overwhelmed and grateful for all that attention. It's really exciting. So um, ways that we're going to be launching our mainnet at the end of March, knock on wood. Obviously we're testing for a reason. So if things surface, we'll be addressing those things, but launching at the end of March. There's a number of different ways that people can get involved. So you can go to our website right now. You can go see the carbon credits that were just sold to Microsoft. You can see kind of how it all works in the progressive web app that connects back to the blockchain. You can sign up if if you happen to be a land steward, or you think you have some land stewards who might want to participate in
Farmers potentially, right?
farmers. Yeah, farmers,
Yeah.
foresters, anybody like that. You can sign up right now. You can get in the pipeline. If you want to buy carbon credits, you can sign up right now. We'll be bringing all of that matchmaking and bring all that up into market shortly. So those are two great ways. If you're a validator, or you're sort of into proof of stake delegating and governing proof of stake networks, we'd welcome you to come and chime in. We've got a very active Discord. We've been trying to leave Telegram behind. We have a fairly big Telegram, but Telegram's kind of crazy for community management. So we're trying to do things on Discord, and it's pretty active over there. So we would welcome people who want to get in and participate in staking, participate in validation, and just sort of like anchoring this public ecological ledger. It's going to be pretty exciting, and there's a pretty strong community behind it now. So we're starting to have lots of fun.
Well, I'm really pumped to see how things go. In the last minute or two that we have left, what have I not asked you that we should have talked about?
Oh, that's a good question. Boy, I think we've really covered it. I am really grateful for getting to chat with you and your audience, Alex, and you and your community have been great support to us
Yeah.
throughout the years here. So I'm just grateful for that and excited about what comes next.
Well, thanks for being on the show, and just to everybody listening, I am an advisor to Regen Network. I probably should have added that to the front
Yeah,
front of the
disclaimer.
show, but a disclaimer. But I'm a huge. I really believe in what these guys are doing, and want them to succeed. And I hope that after listening to this episode, you do too. So please hit them up and jump in and help. And yeah, thanks so much for being here today, Gregory. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, rock on.